of intimate Muslim communities generally, and the American Muslim specifically, is limited, although slowly growing. And to address this gap, this research project started in 2021 to conduct a national survey that examined American Muslim perceptions and experiences of intimate partner violence. This survey in particular was inspired by a 2011 survey conducted by Peaceful Families Project and Project Sakina. Spearheaded by Dr. Bumi Oyewuwa, we are a diverse team of academics, advocates, community members, practitioners, and student scholars dedicated to ending intimate partner violence in our communities. Tahani, Dr. Sohad, Dr. Hanan, Ilyans, Kisha, Bonita, Khadija, and Dr. Denise, and myself. As you will learn today, the goal of the survey is to capture trends and inform the creation and support of existing intervention and prevention strategies. The lack of data presents funding challenges to service organizations and researchers who desire to prevent, intervene, and inform our knowledge of intimate partner violence. Honestly, aside from the research, being part of this team has been a blessing for me personally. Our identities, as Muslim women, we come from diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds. Our experiences with doing the work in the field has impacted not just our work, but our lives as well, and how do we engage with the research in a manner that's considered intersectionality of American Muslim communities, including ourselves. And to me, it set a model for how compassionate research can create spaces for healing and building a community that care about doing this work. So thank you, and hope that the session today will inspire you to learn more about the project and about the team and future projects as well.
Welcome, everyone. It's nice to have you here. We're going to jump into our data brief, and we will talk about 6 buckets of information that we've learned from this project. So the first bucket we're going to talk about of information is prevalence. So one of the things we wanted to capture in the survey that we conducted was how prevalent intimate partner violence was in the American Muslim community. And we asked this in 3 ways. We asked about prevalence in terms of if you knew someone who has experienced intimate partner violence, if you had experienced violence by a family member, not other than an intimate partner violence, getting at sort of broader family violence questions, and then specifically, have you experienced intimate partner violence? What we found is that despite programming to address intimate partner violence in American Muslim communities, prevalence rates have not really changed and remains a significant problem. So as you can see from the infographic on your screen, 77% of American Muslims surveyed indicated that they did know someone who had experienced intimate partner violence. Again, looking at the question about had they experienced family violence other than an intimate partner, 44% of the folks surveyed indicated that they had experienced violence by a family member other than an intimate partner. And then when we asked specifically about what our study was concerned with about intimate partner violence, 36% of folks in the survey indicated that they had experienced intimate partner violence. We were very interested in looking at if there were any demographic or social identity constructs that were related to intimate partner violence prevalence. So are certain groups within the diversity of the American Muslim community more likely to experience intimate partner violence than others? What we found is what we know generally from the research, that intimate partner violence is gendered. So when we looked at gender and intimate partner violence, we found that 40% of American Muslim women reported experiencing IPV, compared to 10% of American Muslim men in our survey who had taken the survey had reported experiencing IPV. When we looked at other social identity constructs such as race, immigration status, socioeconomic status, and education, we found no significant differences in IPV prevalence. So we for each of these issues that we were concerned with the survey, we asked, what is next? How can this be addressed? And as was said in our intro, American Muslims are a racially and ethnically diverse group with no racial or ethnic majority, but there is a need to invest in accessible, faith-based, culturally and linguistically specific outreach and intervention models, right? So in our survey, we were capturing the prevalence, and we, like I said, looked at if there were any differences in social identity construct, but it doesn't mean that people aren't experiencing and accessing services differently. So we need to be attuned to the diversity within our communities when we are thinking about how to address and prevent violence in our communities. The next piece, if we can move to COVID, the next COVID slide, thank you. The next piece of information we were interested in looking at was COVID. So our survey was taken between 2021 and 2023. So when we were developing the survey in late 2020, we were at the height of COVID. So it was something that we wanted to understand and capture, particularly looking at American Muslims' experiences, understanding that COVID-19 really exacerbated existing issues. So we asked questions of survivors about COVID-19, and we learned some things. So we found that American Muslims were impacted by the intersectional burden of the COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, when we asked people, those who had indicated if they had experienced intimate partner violence, we also asked if they had experienced intimate partner violence during the COVID-19 pandemic, recognizing that people taking the survey may have been currently experiencing IPV, may have experienced it in the past, right? So we really wanted to capture, if the experience of violence that they were indicating happened in that COVID-19 pandemic. And when we looked at that, 35% of American Muslims who had experienced intimate partner violence indicated having experienced it during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this, we were particularly interested in access to services, given the ways that COVID-19 really shifted how service delivery had to be done for safety reasons, for health reasons, right? For all of the reasons. So when we asked about if it impacted their ability to access services, 20% of survivors who experienced IPV during COVID-19 indicated having difficulty accessing services, compared to 5% of the survivors who experienced IPV before COVID-19 reporting having difficulty accessing services. So there was a disparity. Those who had experienced IPV during COVID-19 had more difficulty in accessing services than those who had experienced IPV before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. We wanted to know more about what that experience was like. So we did have some qualitative questions on the survey to understand what were those barriers? And you'll see on your screen a few quotes from the survivors about their experiences. One person said, "I tried to file suit to take my children back from my ex-husband, and because of COVID, the legal process took an extra year. I lost my kids for an extra year." So you can see that it impacted not just the process, but the time. And you can imagine the weight that this has on survivors who are trying to find stability and safety in their lives, not just for themselves, but for their children. Another participant said, "I was not able to call appropriate outlets. Some professionals are not in offices, right? Offices were closed, things operated differently. So people had more difficulty accessing the services in the ways that we typically constructed them, right?" Another person said, "My husband works from home and I am not allowed to leave." So because of the work environment, the way we were working from home, that created even more barriers to accessing services and seeking services for survivors. Another person said, "Lockdown, you can't walk into a place anymore and receive services. You call a call center and get passed around, then hung up on, or never assisted." So you can imagine the frustration that survivors who, when they were able to make a call for help, that they were experiencing, that frustration of trying to get through to get the services they need. And finally, this last survivor said, "It was so risky and hard to go out every day to seek help from different family violence prevention services. And also processes would take so much longer than expected, especially mailing services for protective order and stuff like that." So again, the whole system of IPV service delivery was clogged, right? Having to now try and reach those services that may have offices open or not, but also the legal system that had been clogged because of the inability to do things the way we had been done before, what was normal, right? So COVID-19 definitely did impact the survivors in our study. And they allowed us to understand that through their qualitative as well as their quantitative responses. So we're going to move on to attitudes.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Tahani Chaudhry. I work with Peaceful Families Project as the Research and Resource Development Coordinator, and I have been a part of the AMIPV team for a long time. So I'm very grateful to be able to present this data to you all. We're very excited about it. So Dr. Denise mentioned in the beginning that one of the main mission for Peaceful Families Project is eliminating family-based violence in American Muslim communities. And we believe that that is an issue of social change. And in order to achieve social change, we have to touch every single member of the American Muslim community. And so in order to achieve that social change, what we need to understand is, what do American Muslims believe about IPV? What are their attitudes towards IPV? And so we were able to do that in this survey by looking at 3 specific domains of IPV. So we looked particularly at psychological abuse and what American Muslims believed about that. We looked at physical violence because that tends to be one of the first things people think about when they're thinking about IPV. And then we also looked at controlling behaviors. So these were the 3 domains that we were looking at in terms of IPV domains and what American Muslims believe about them. And our main takeaway here is that, well, generally, American Muslims don't accept any one of these types of IPV behaviors. There's very low acceptance of psychological abuse, physical violence, and controlling behaviors. And so what you'll see on the screen here is that we pulled out the top 10 attitudes in terms of the attitudes that were rising to the top in that people felt the most strongly about. And you'll see things related to just a complete lack of acceptance of emotional abuse and psychological abuse. So things like 99% of American Muslims thought it was a problem if a partner was insulting them in front of others. 96% of them believed it was not okay to blame their partner when they're doing bad things, or for the partner to blame them when they're doing bad things. So you see that there's this low threshold of acceptance of these types of psychological abuse or manipulation. We can also see that there is a lack of acceptance of physical violence. So 95% of American Muslims believe it is not okay to ever kick, bite, or hit your partner. And then as we kind of go down the list, we see even more things about things like some of the manipulation and controlling behaviors. And we see this at a little bit of a lesser extent. So you'll see at the bottom, 70% of American Muslims believe it is not okay for them to tell their partner to not talk to someone of the opposite sex. So thinking of some of those pieces of controlling your partner's behaviors and their actions and having that control over them. So generally, we are finding that when we look at the entire sample, American Muslims are not tolerant of any of these behaviors. And when we go to the next slide, we wanted to look at this a little bit more closely. We wanted to look at, well, what are the places where we are seeing some of those differences? Because as Dr. Bumi mentioned earlier, we are a very diverse community. And so we looked at some of these attitudes along those axes of diversity. So although there is a generally low acceptance of IPV, we did find that there were differences in attitudes towards abuse, violence, and control by some of these factors, like gender, someone having already experienced IPV, or someone knowing someone else who has experienced IPV. And as Dr. Bumi mentioned in the beginning, 77% of American Muslims know someone who has experienced IPV. So let's talk first about gender. So what we found here is that men have a higher acceptance of attitudes towards psychological abuse and controlling behaviors, but not physical violence. So what we're seeing is that men have a very low tolerance for physical violence. But when it comes to those other, maybe less commonly thought of forms of IPV, like the mental and psychological forms of abuse, or those controlling behaviors, they have a higher acceptance of it compared to women. And then when we look at women, they had a higher acceptance of physical violence compared to men. And so it's really important that we understand these gender dynamics that play a role in our community, in our understandings of IPV. What is the first thing someone is thinking of when they're thinking of IPV? Are they only thinking of physical abuse? Nope, that's not okay. Or are they also thinking of some of those manipulation tactics, the power and control dynamics that are at play? And what we're finding is that men might be having a higher tolerance of some of those control dynamics than women generally. And this is something we need to explore more. The second thing is that people who experience IPV have a higher acceptance of physical violence, but a lower acceptance of controlling behaviors compared to those who don't experience IPV. And this is really important because it really highlights that difference between physical violence and our focus on physical violence versus really emphasizing just the impact of power and control in a relationship, particularly to someone who has experienced abuse in their own relationships and how intolerable it is for them. We also see this pattern in folks who know someone who has experienced IPV. So people who know someone who has experienced IPV also have a lower acceptance of controlling behaviors than those who don't know someone who has experienced IPV. So we see this continual trend across our community where that experience of IPV, knowing someone who's experienced IPV, and being a woman generally, which as Dr. Boomy mentioned earlier, means that you're at a higher risk of experiencing IPV, puts you on a higher awareness of those controlling behaviors and a lower acceptance for those behaviors. The final thing that we looked at in this, in this domain is community awareness. So we asked folks, have you attended a talk on domestic violence, either generally somewhere or particularly in your masjid, in your mosque? And what we found is that folks who have attended a talk on domestic violence, either generally or in their mosque, this didn't affect their attitudes towards abuse, control, or violence. And so we can think about, okay, well, what are those talks doing and how do we ensure that those talks are really getting to the core of the problem and changing attitudes if we're trying to achieve social change? And how do we ensure that those talks are being more effective in that way? One of the other things that we thought was really important to understand, particularly when it comes to attitudes, is American Muslims' understandings of Islamic obligations of marriage. And this is important in the community because when you're thinking about a community that values their religious values and shapes their understandings of their relationships based on their understandings of their religion, it's really important to understand how those Islamic obligations of marriage shape their understanding. And what we found here is that, so we asked participants, is it the Islamic right of a man to have sex with his wife whenever he wants, even if the wife does not want? And this is a commonly discussed and commonly misunderstood concept in, thinking about the American Muslim community. And what we found in this sample is that 83% of American Muslims disagreed. They don't think it is the Islamic right of a man to have sex with his wife without her consent. On the other hand, what that also means is that 10% agreed. So while majority of the Muslim community is against this, there is still work to be done. We also asked the flip because we wanted to look closely at the gender roles that might play a role in this understanding of your Islamic obligations. And when we asked the same question about, well, is it the Islamic right of a Muslim woman to have sex with her husband whenever she wants, even if the husband doesn't want to, we found the same number in that 83% of American Muslims disagreed. On the flip side, what we found is that 8% agreed. So regardless of gender, we're seeing that same pattern where majority of people have this understanding of their Islamic rights as this is not okay. And their belief towards your Islamic obligations is that consent is required. And we have a small minority of folks where there's more work that can be done. And so when we think about, well, what do we take away from this information? What do we do about this? And inshallah, we'll continue to talk about what can we take away and do about this information in the roundtables coming up. But what we find is that currently, majority of IPV programs do focus on physical violence. They focus on providing shelter, they focus on providing safety, but we see clearly that there's a need to address the controlling behaviors. There is a need to address that piece of abuse that is more focused on the control aspect, because that is really what survivors and people who know survivors are finding more intolerable than even the physical violence. And so while it is really important to ensure safety, providing shelter, providing tangible resources, it is simultaneously also really important to help survivors regain control over aspects of their lives. This could be things like control over their movements, where they can go, not being limited to a specific location, their ability to make decisions, their personal affairs. And this could include things like their access to their immigration documents, their access to just understanding their important decisions when it comes to their life, and also relationships, who they're talking to, who they're being friends with. So it's really important that we focus on all of those aspects of regaining control and empowering survivors to regain control, as well as the reducing physical violence and ensuring safety. And simultaneously, it's really important that we also understand that the current community level approach to awareness building may not be changing attitudes the way we would like for it to change. And so we need to reevaluate how we're addressing these attitudes within communities. And so when we are having those talks around domestic violence, either generally in our organizations or particularly in mosques and Muslim communities, it's really important that we focus specifically on, are we actually changing the attitudes and beliefs that the people are coming in with?
So another theme that we looked at and asked about on the survey was, how did survivors cope with the violence they had experienced? So if a person indicated that they had experienced intimate partner violence, we asked about a wide range of coping strategies that they may have utilized. How helpful were those strategies if they utilized them, and were there any consequences to utilizing any of the strategies? We did this because we wanted to understand the wide range of ways people deal with violence, so that we can make sure and inform how we increase the ability for people to stay safe and facilitate their safety. So what we found was that American Muslim survivors use a wide range of coping strategies to respond to the abuse that they've experienced. Some were helpful, as well as having simultaneous consequences. So what you'll see here on the screen are the top 5 coping strategies that survivors indicated endorsing. So the most frequently used in coping strategy was trying to avoid the partner. This was what's known as a placating strategy that survivors use to minimize the abuse without directly challenging the partner. When we looked at and asked about helpfulness, we found that 53% of survivors said that this was a helpful strategy. However, we also found that about 46% indicated experiencing a negative consequence. So while this was a well-used strategy, with 86% of survivors utilizing it, it had relatively high helpfulness, right? With 53% saying it was helpful, just over half, but it also had about just under half saying they experienced a negative consequence to utilizing this strategy of avoiding their partner. We also, like I said, we indicated the top 5. So the next most frequently used strategy was turning to prayer. So in the survey, we asked not just about coping strategies that we may typically think about in terms of safety planning, avoiding partners, utilizing the legal system or formal and informal resources. We also recognize that religious strategies may be what survivors turn to. And so we asked a few questions about religious and spiritual coping strategies that they might utilize. When we did that, one of the religious strategies was one of the top 5 strategies, with turning to prayer being utilized by 83% of survivors. This was a religious coping strategy that survivors turned to, where using religious practices for guidance and support in dealing with the situation of intimate partner violence. It had a relatively high helpfulness rating of 67% and a very low negative consequence of only 6% of survivors indicating having experienced a negative consequence to turning to prayer to cope with the domestic violence, the intimate partner violence that they were experiencing. The third highest or most frequently used strategy was fighting back verbally. This was a resistance strategies that survivors used to challenge the partner and to regain power. Just under half, so 43% found it to be helpful, but this was one of the strategies, while frequently used, had a high consequence, where 72% of survivors indicated experiencing a negative consequence to using fighting back verbally as a coping strategy. Fourth was ending or trying to end the relationship. This was a resistance strategy, similar to how I described fighting back verbally being a resistance strategy. This is one that's used to challenge the partner and regain power. 78% found it to be helpful, which was, one of the highest helpfulness ratings. However, 64% experienced negative consequences. And what we know, for those of you who, we all here are interested in this work. We've probably spent a lot of time invested in this work. We know that survivors are often asked about why they don't leave. We also know that it's one of the most dangerous times in the relationship. So while there might be high helpfulness, it's at high risk as well. And that's really important for us to recognize and really educate people about, particularly when people ask these questions about why they don't leave. It has a high consequence, as you can see here. And then the fifth most frequently used coping strategy was reading the Quran, which was another religious coping strategy that survivors used for guidance and support. 72% found reading the Quran for guidance to be helpful, where only 7% experienced a negative consequence. So as you can see here, again, we only highlighted the top 5 coping strategies. There were lots of different ways survivors indicated coping and dealing with the domestic violence they were experiencing. But what you can see is that not all strategies, even though they were highly used, were necessarily highly helpful. And some of them that were highly helpful also had high consequence. So there was high risk. So what we found was that resistance strategies, so things like fighting back verbally, ending the relationship, had both high helpfulness, but also high consequence, right? And while religious strategies had high helpfulness, as well as low consequence. So we also looked at other types of coping strategies, such as informal supports, and these helpfulness and consequence varied widely, right? So we asked about seeking help through family and friends and things like that. And while it might have been helpful, it also varied in its consequence. And so we really need to, when we're talking with survivors and talking with people, to educate them in the community about domestic violence and how we need to create these supports and intervene, really consider that it's beyond just a response, right? There's oftentimes high risk and a lot of different decisions that survivors have to make based on their situational context when they're trying to keep themselves safe. And so what we need to focus on supporting survivors around these different coping strategies to ensure that they are able to facilitate their safety, and that our communities can also facilitate their safety.
All right. So thinking about just all of the decisions that our survivor is facing, right? A lot of the decisions of, okay, how do I cope? Who do I turn to for help? What do I do? It was really important for us to really understand the impact of experiencing intimate partner violence on a survivor's mental health. So when we talk about mental health, we were specifically looking at things like their general experience of stress. We were then looking also more specifically at anxiety-related symptoms and depression-related symptoms. And then given the trauma of intimate partner violence, we were also asking questions related to PTSD-related symptoms. So things like hypervigilance, memory, bad memories, avoidance, flashbacks, etc. And so we asked all of these questions related to mental health to both survivors and to the folks who did not experience intimate partner violence in our sample. And what we found really reiterates what we already know about the mental health impact of experiences of IPV that has been well documented in the literature. But what we have found is that for American Muslims as well, survivors of intimate partner violence have a greater mental health burden than those who have not experienced intimate partner violence. They have higher levels of reported stress, more anxiety-related symptoms, more depression-related symptoms, and more PTSD-related symptoms. So across the board, survivors are experiencing a significantly higher burden on their mental health than those who are not, understandably. And it was really important for us to reiterate these findings, particularly for the American Muslim community, because one, this data doesn't exist before for American Muslims, and two, it's so important for us as a community and as service providers to understand the impact that these experiences are having on the person's mental health so that we can support them. So what we looked at after mental health is, well, what are they doing about it? right? So we looked at things like their mental health help seeking and the impact of that help seeking on them. And what we found is that a little over half of survivors did seek mental health counseling for themselves. So 55% of survivors sought mental health counseling. And from those, what we're finding is that almost all of them, 98.6% of them, found counseling to be at least slightly helpful. Now, as a therapist, I do have to say that when you are doing therapy, you want your therapy to be a little bit more than just at least slightly helpful. So there's a lot for us to talk about in terms of the quality of that care and how can we ensure that it is very helpful and not just slightly helpful. But generally, when we're looking at it across the board, the survivors who are going are gaining some benefit from it. And yet simultaneously, kind of going back to this idea of that messy middle ground where some services can be helpful and harmful at the same time. What we found is that 21% of survivors actually experienced negative consequences from seeking counseling for themselves. And it could be a range of negative consequences. So it's really important for us to understand that while, yes, therapy and counseling is really helpful, we need to simultaneously take the responsibility of how do we minimize those negative consequences while maximizing the beneficial impact of counseling. One of the other ways that mental health help seeking actually showed up in our sample was that survivors were often seeking help, seeking mental health help for their partners. So they were seeking counseling for their partner. So we found that 41% of survivors tried to get their partner counseling for intimate partner violence. And as you can see on the screen, it was not as helpful. So while 30% of survivors did say, hey, this was at least slightly helpful to get my partner counseling for what is happening in our relationship right now, more than half found that there were actually strong negative consequences to that help. So 65% of survivors said that they were experiencing some kind of negative consequences after trying to get their partner mental health help, counseling for the relationship violence. And so what we take away from all of this information really is that, one, we really need to tailor our mental health services for American Muslim survivors of intimate partner violence because there are gaps present that we need to fill when they're seeking help. So what that may look like is, one, how do we increase the quality of the mental health help that we are offering them so that it is more culturally specific, it is more faith specific, so that it is relevant to all of their intersectional identities, and it is meeting their needs so that we can increase the beneficial impact of it. And simultaneously, we need to reduce the negative consequences. And then what we can also look at is, well, what does partner counseling look like in American Muslims who are trying to get counseling for their partners? Because a lot of times, it isn't always that the survivor is just saying, hey, I just want to leave this relationship. A lot of times, it's just that they want the violence to stop. And so they want their partner to seek help to get the violence to stop. So are there ways that we can focus more on the partner who is abusing to ensure that we are minimizing the harm there? And there are ways that we have addressed that through Peaceful Families Project that we can talk more about later. So finally, we're going to end on just community response, because as we know, it's really important for us to address intimate partner violence as an entire community, rather placing the burden on survivors to ensure their own safety, to ensure the violence stops, to leave. As a community, what we need to do is say, no, we need to stop the violence. And when 77% of American Muslims know someone who has experienced intimate partner violence, it's all the more important that those American Muslims are doing something about it. So when we asked questions related to, okay, well, if you know someone who's experiencing intimate partner violence, what did you do about it? What we found is that almost 90% of them did something to respond to that violence instead of just turning away. And that's important. It's important for us to know that people care and people are doing something about it. But when we look more specifically at, okay, well, then what are they doing about it? What we have here is the top 5 strategies that people typically used. So the most frequent one was that they talked to the victim. So 73% of people who knew someone who's experiencing IPV, they went and talked to the victim directly. To a lesser extent, we found that 63% of American Muslims prayed and made dua. So instead of turning to the situation directly, what they did is they turned to God. And this really mirrors that piece that we saw earlier in terms of survivors' coping strategies, which is that religious, spiritual coping and responses to the situation is actually really important to American Muslims. And it's something that we really need to address and talk about how this is actually something really helpful for our community. 1/3 of people sought advice from a domestic violence program, which means they identified that this was domestic violence, and they tried to turn to the experts for help. 27% sought advice from an imam or someone in the Muslim community. So that also shows us how important it is for our imams and leaders and just general community members in our Muslim community to be trained and prepared to deal with the domestic violence, because we're turning to each other for help. We're turning to each other to say, oh my goodness, what do I do about this? And it's really important that we know what to do about it. 23% of folks talked directly to the abuser. They talked directly to the perpetrator of violence. And then the least common, but 20% of folks directly intervened during the incident. And I really want to note on that last piece, because a lot of times people think that bystander intervention means directly intervening. And that's not always the case, because you may not always see the violence happening right in front of you. So while 20% intervened directly during the incident, that's likely because they saw the incident happening in front of them, but that's not the case for everyone. And so it's really important that we are intervening and making a difference at some of those other levels, talking to each other, seeking resources, finding support, changing attitudes and beliefs, because those are typically the things that we see around us, as opposed to the actual incident happening in front of us. And then finally, 12% of folks who said that they knew someone who experienced intimate partner violence did nothing. And that could be for a variety of reasons that we need to explore more. It could mean they didn't think it was a big deal. It could mean they felt helpless and didn't feel like they had control or power to do something. Or it could mean that they didn't know what to do and didn't have the resources that they needed to actually be able to intervene. So that was looking at community response at that individual level, someone who knows who has experienced intimate partner violence. But we also looked at that community response at the communal level. So what is the awareness in the Muslim community? And what we found is that 35% of American Muslims say that their Islamic center or mosque has had a khutbah or has had a public discussion on IPV. 35% is great, and we need to get that up to 100. We also find that 44% of American Muslims have attended a program that discusses IPV in the American Muslim community. So again, what we're taking away from here is that there is a clear desire in the Muslim community to respond to IPV. 90% of people do respond in various ways. And there's a clear desire to do it through community-based programming, community-based settings. And the change is already happening from within the community. What is important for us as service providers, as government organizations, as funders, is how do we support and elevate these responses so that they are more effective and more beneficial for the survivors and beneficial in eliminating gender-based violence in our communities.
Okay. Well, this is Bonita. So I just want to thank the research team once again for your work and dedication to that. And I wanted to just preference some of the Q&A before we get started. So before I want to check to make sure that, are there any more comments from the panel at all about the research before we go into the Q&A? Good. Okay. So this is how we're going to do Q&A. I see that you're already actively engaged in the Q&A. We are going to try to answer as many questions as we can about what you've raised, and you can upvote certain questions, but we'll start with the ones that are kind of coalescing. So the first question regarding the surveys that I saw a few times was that is sample size and how was the sample selected? So if someone on the panel can begin to answer that, that would be great.
Yes, great question. So we went about this survey by, we employed availability sampling. So we sought out through our networks, through social media, through community presentations, folks across the country to take this survey. In total, we had 366 people complete the survey. And that was a variety of age ranges, a variety of ethnic and racial backgrounds, a variety of immigration statuses and where people were born. This also included, men and women in the sample. So we had a wide range of folks who completed the survey with a total sample size of 366.
And just to follow up with that, Bumi, there's a follow-up question that says, was there an increase in frequency or intensity during DV during COVID? We have two people who were curious about, based on what you guys presented, it didn't seem that there was an increase. So if you could just speak to that.
That's a good question. We didn't look at if there was an increase in IPV in COVID times. We rather asked, had you experienced IPV during COVID, to better understand for those folks what their context was, and to allow for comparison. For those who had experienced IPV during COVID, was their experience different from those who had not experienced IPV during COVID? Which is why on that slide you saw the access to services, that one was different, where 20% of folks who had experienced IPV during COVID experienced difficulty accessing service versus only 5% of those who experienced it during COVID. We also asked those qualitative questions because we wanted to understand what made it different, which is where those qualitative responses came from. But in terms of, was there an increase in IPV in the American Muslim community during COVID or not, we did not explore that. And so we don't have any definitive answers there. But was there a different experience? Yes, we saw that for sure.
Thank you. We have another question here too regarding religious coping strategies. So one is from Muhammad. He was like, he wonders if religious coping strategies just make the victim more complacent and accepting of abuse coming their way. And so you can start with that one, and then there's a follow-up question from there.
I'm going to open up to my team before I jump in, but I'll let others tackle that one before I jump in.
I think we're all looking at you since that's your area. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead, Dr. Denise.
No, I was passing it to Tahani since that's her area of specialty, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think so in this particular sample, that's not something we directly looked at, right? So we can't give you reason, like what was the, attitude change or impact after people sought that religious coping or help. But we do find from a lot of literature and folks who are currently working on a lot of this work is that turning to prayer, turning to sacred text is not just a passive strategy, actually. It is a very active strategy in that people are turning to prayer and religious sources of support, like turning to God for guidance. It is a way for them to help them make the decisions that they need to make. As you saw in the coping strategy slide, survivors have a lot of decisions that they need to make, and it is very difficult to make those decisions, especially when you have that mental health burden and impact, right? It's harder to make those decisions in those times. And so turning to pray and even sacred texts like the Quran for guidance is actually a really active way of saying, okay, what do I do in this situation? A lot of the work that Peaceful Families does is actually talking about how religious strategies like prayer, like sunnah, like turning to religion, actually give us a lot of guidance on how Islam is completely against all sorts of oppression, how it is completely, how it is the responsibility of every Muslim to do as much as they can to end any kind of oppression that is happening on them, but also for others who are seeing oppression happening to end oppression that is happening in front of them. And so when we think about these religious social support strategies, a lot of times the assumption is that it makes people more accepting of abuse, but that may not actually be true in people's, real experiences.
And I want to add that we specifically added the questions to the survey around religious and spiritual coping strategies because of the research we had done before coming together as a team, right? So I know in my previous research, religious coping strategies were a source of strength. They were ways in which it facilitated survivors seeking help, leaving the relationship. But we don't see that we hadn't seen that in the literature really explored about religious coping strategies and their helpfulness and consequence. And Tahani also has done research around this in terms of the religious coping strategies for intimate partner violence survivors. So that's even why we put the question in there, because existing research had not explored it. So whether or not it makes them more complacent, we didn't explore that question. But what we did see was it had high helpfulness and low consequence. So based on what our own previous individual research says and what we're seeing here, it's something that definitely needs to be explored more and supported more when we're talking about survivors and how they're dealing with the intimate partner violence they've experienced.
So thank you for that. I wanted to just acknowledge that Sophia had a similar question of can you go into the percentage of people who found turning to prayer to be harmful? And it sounds like from your response that you don't have that type of data, but I wanted to acknowledge that Sophia has asked that question. Was it qualified, and what are your reflections on this?
And
so
I
if
think
you
Dr. Hasna, also you had something to.
absolutely.
I think Bubi and Tahani covered it well, so it's good.
Right. So we also have more questions. We have, were there any findings regarding prevention around the topic?
So that's a good question. We didn't ask specifically about prevention, but we did ask questions about communities' ways of responding to domestic violence, which is why you'll see on that last brief that Tahani presented on community response, right? So we asked about, had your mosque community or your Muslim community done any conversations or had any conversations around intimate partner violence. We also asked about, we'd also talked about whether or not that seemed to have any effect on the prevalence or on the, attitudes of intimate partner violence. So we didn't really ask about prevention specifically, but what we found is giving us insights into the sites of prevention that we need to tackle and what that needs to look like, because even when there are conversations happening, it's not, what we're seeing is not necessarily directly related to changing attitudes. So while it's happening, we need to support it. And those are sites for prevention and intervention that we hope continues to, we can build on from this work.
And as you know, a lot of the work of PFP, of course, is in the area of prevention. So we actually do not do direct service, but do a lot of work around what are the touch points in the Muslim life, including parenting, middle school, high school, university age, selection of a partner, the working with male leaders within the Muslim community, and then even at the point of grief, divorce, and separation, that these are all touch points within the Muslim lifespan, so to speak, where we can make differences, where we can begin to talk about, where we can offer other alternatives. And all of our programs have some data around them in terms of showing impact. But we are also looking at, while we are very excited about this study, we are also now sponsoring a Muslim male a survey looking at beliefs, attitudes, and experiences of family-based violence, and we'll soon, inshallah, in June, beginning a youth study looking not only at beliefs and attitudes around family-based violence, but something called courtship coercion, right? That period of time before marriage, where we're also seeing stalking and a lot of technology facilitated gender-based violence that we are looking at as well. So I think all of those things together, along with this study, will begin to answer the questions around prevention.
All right, I see we have 2 minutes left. There are 2 questions still left. I will just kind of make that as a precursor for some announcements. First of all, we have one question about any findings regarding differences across cultures and racial groups. And the next question was the role of Muslim chaplains. I would encourage you that if you're still interested in those conversations, we have a series of roundtables where we're going to be going into deep dives into these types of questions. So please take a look at that series and sign up so we can get deeper into the data and into what we can do in response to that. I wanted to acknowledge and thank the entire panel, our research team, and everyone, and make another note that all of this data is going to be available on the Peaceful Families Project website. So please be on the lookout. All of you who have participated in today's briefing will get a recording, a message. They will get the data briefs and the recording for your purposes. And with that, I will just open up to the panel for any final round of thoughts or nuggets that you want to share to the community on this. Thank you.
I just want to thank you all for being here today. This was a culmination of nearly 4 years of work, and it was not easy to get to this point, but we kept going because of our passion and our commitment to ending violence across all communities. So we invited you here today just so that we can continue to have this conversation collectively and strategize collectively as to how to deal with this issue that's affecting us across communities. So thank you all for being here, for listening, and we look forward to the questions and the conversations that we'll have in our future sessions.
And with that, I'd like to thank you all. You'll be hearing from us. Please engage us in further discussion via the roundtables, and have a blessed, wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.